Take off your clothes. You are now prisoner 819. These weren't words from an actual prison, but from a psychology experiment where college students were paid $15 a day to play pretend. Within hours, the pretending stopped, and the nightmare began. The Stanford Prison Experiment was terminated after just 6 days instead of the planned 14. What turned an innocent play into a sadistic and twisted science experiment? Let's find out. In 1971, a group of 24 college students agreed to take part in what they were told was a simple psychology experiment at Stanford University. They were healthy, smart, normal. But within just a few days, things changed. And it all started with a coin flip. The volunteers who had come there for $15 a day were randomly assigned to be either prisoners or guards without any guidance, and that one decision, made by chance, would change everything. The basement of Stanford's psychology building, Jordan Hall, was turned into a mock prison. But this wasn't some cheap role-play setup. This place was designed to mess with your mind. There were no windows, no clocks, no sunlight, just concrete walls, cold floors, and cells barely big enough to stretch your arms in. Each prisoner was stripped, searched, given a uniform with a number, and that's what they were called from then on. Not by name, just a number. And if they stepped out of line, there was a tiny, pitch-black closet where they'd be locked for hours, alone. That was solitary. But here's where it gets interesting. The experiment didn't start in the basement. It started at their homes. Zimbardo, the lead psychologist, coordinated with real police officers. They actually showed up at the volunteers' houses in full uniform. Neighbors watched as these innocent students were handcuffed, searched, read their rights, and shoved into patrol cars, like actual criminals. They were taken to a real police station, fingerprinted, booked, and left in holding cells. No one explained what was happening. No one told them it was part of the study. By the time they made it to the basement prison, their minds were already unraveling. What followed in that basement over the next 6 days would become one of the most disturbing psychological case studies in history. When the prisoners finally arrived at the basement of Stanford's psychology building, things got worse, much worse. Before they could even step inside, the guards, who just the day before were their classmates, told them to strip, in full view of everyone. Then they sprayed them down with what they called delousing solution. It wasn't real, but the message was, "You're dirty." Every personal belonging was taken. Their clothes were replaced with smocks, basically long, uncomfortable dresses. Then came the nylon caps, tight, itchy, pulled down over their heads like a punishment. And around their ankles, guards fastened a heavy metal chain. Every time a prisoner took a step, clink, clink, clink. A sound that reminded them, you don't belong to yourself anymore. But here's where things get really disturbing. While the prisoners were being stripped of their identity, the guards were building one. They wore matching khaki uniforms. Each one carried a whistle, a billy club, and most disturbingly, mirrored sunglasses that completely blocked their eyes. So when a prisoner tried to look a guard in the face, they didn't see a person. They saw themselves, powerless, exposed, and completely alone. It didn't take long. Hours after the experiment began, things started happening. At 2:30 a.m., on the very first night, the guards burst into the cells, blowing whistles, screaming orders, forcing the prisoners into line. They made them recite their ID numbers over and over again, loudly, until the numbers weren't just random, they became real. The guards had been told one thing, no physical violence, but that didn't stop them. Instead, it made them creative. And what followed was a descent into psychological torment so disturbing, the experiment would have to be shut down early. By the second day, the breaking point arrived. Frustrated by increasingly harsh treatment, the prisoners rebelled. They ripped off their identification numbers, removed their caps, and barricaded themselves in their cells using their beds. What happened next shocked even the researchers. The guards called for reinforcements, including night shift guards who weren't scheduled to work but volunteered to stay and help crush the rebellion. They used fire extinguishers to force the prisoners out, stripped the rebellion leaders naked, and threw them into solitary confinement. The remaining prisoners were forced to do push-ups as punishment, not for minutes, but for hours. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, prisoner number 8612 began to break down. He started crying uncontrollably. Then came the rage, violent outbursts, incoherent rambling. Rather than helping him, the guards saw an opportunity. They offered him informant status, trying to turn him against his fellow prisoners. When his condition worsened, the researchers finally removed him from the experiment. What started as role play had transformed into psychological warfare. The guards created a system of privilege cells, rewarding certain prisoners with better food, better beds, and shorter punishment times. This deliberate strategy divided the prisoners and broke their solidarity. Some prisoners began informing on others, hoping to earn favor with the guards. The line between experiment and reality had dissolved completely, and watching it all was the lead researcher, Philip Zimbardo, who himself had fallen into the role of prison superintendent rather than objective scientist. He should have stepped in, but he didn't. By day 3, the basement prison at Stanford no longer felt like an experiment. The guards now ruled with complete psychological control. They developed systems of rewards and punishments that grew increasingly creative and humiliating. Some prisoners were forced to clean toilets with their bare hands. Others endured endless push-ups that left their muscles trembling and bodies covered in sweat. The prisoner counts that originally took just 10 minutes now stretched into hours of standing at attention, reciting numbers, and enduring verbal abuse. Even more troubling was the behavior of the lead researcher, Philip Zimbardo. Rather than maintaining scientific objectivity, he watched as the abuse escalated and did nothing to stop it. In fact, some evidence suggests he actively encouraged it. The guards stopped emptying the prisoners' toilet buckets, allowing the stench to fill the cells. This wasn't an oversight. It was a calculated decision. The guards reasoned that the horrible smell served as additional punishment for misbehavior. The psychological effects on the prisoners became impossible to ignore. Several broke down in uncontrollable crying fits. Others experienced bouts of rage that seemed to come from nowhere. Many developed acute anxiety that manifested in physical symptoms. One prisoner's mental distress became so severe that a rash appeared across his entire body. This wasn't a mild irritation. This was a full-body psychosomatic reaction that appeared after he was denied parole. Perhaps most revealing about the transformation was the behavior of the guards when not being directly observed. They worked extra voluntary shifts without any additional pay. They had internalized their roles so completely that maintaining power over their prisoners became its own reward. And we're talking about days, not weeks, not months, mere days. As the days passed, the situation grew darker. Everyone was caught in the manufactured reality of this prison world. Everyone, except one person. Christina Maslach, a recent Stanford PhD graduate and Zimbardo's future wife, provided the outside perspective that finally broke the spell. When she visited the mock prison, she was horrified by what she saw. Unlike everyone else involved, she hadn't been gradually desensitized to the escalating abuse. She confronted Zimbardo directly about the conditions. "It's terrible what you are doing to these boys," she told him. Her words cut through the prison superintendent persona and reached the scientist who had lost his way. What Zimbardo saw disturbed him enough to make a dramatic decision. The experiment, planned for 2 weeks, was terminated after just 6 days. This wasn't because they had gathered enough data or reached some scientific milestone. It was because the situation had become dangerous to the participants' mental health. What began as a controlled psychological study had morphed into a nightmare of ethical failures. The experiment didn't just reveal something about prison dynamics, it exposed the dangers of scientific research without proper ethical guardrails. The participants hadn't given fully informed consent. They weren't adequately protected from psychological harm. And perhaps most damning, the researchers themselves encouraged the very abusive behaviors they claimed to be merely observing. 50 years later, the Stanford Prison Experiment stands as a warning of how quickly power corrupts, how easily people slip into assigned roles, and how dangerous it is when those in charge prioritize results over human welfare. But its most important legacy? The ethical guidelines now protecting research participants from psychological harm. Rules created directly because of those 6 dark days in a Stanford University basement in 1971. As always, if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe for more dark and strange real-life stories, just like this one. See you next time.